Great. Martha, do I need to turn on the subtitling or do you do that?
I've got it on,
Okay,
so it should be showing.
great. Okay, good to start. Yep. All
Yes.
right, good. If any of you didn't see the sort of brief introduction I gave previously, I'm really interested in finding out about how students uh, apply value to species that we're trying to conserve, and especially finding ways that students can understand uh, how and why other people may value species differently than they do. And so I've been developing an exercise over the past couple of years in my conservation biology class that I'm eager to share and get some feedback on, find out how other people might use that. Um, and anytime someone has questions, I guess I don't see the chat, do I, when I'm in presenter mode?
It
But
will come out. It'll sort of be a pop-out window.
okay,
You just have to
let,
select it.
let me know if I don't notice it.
Yeah.
All right, so first I wanted to tell you a little bit about my course. It's an introductory course in conservation biology, and I inherited this course from another professor who is retired. And at first I was a little shocked about how introductory it was because it's meant to be an upper level undergraduate course. Um, but I guess with time, I'm appreciating more and more uh, the benefits of teaching something really at an introductory level because so few of our students know anything at all about conservation. And I've sort of put up here the course description and the learning outcomes to emphasize two things that are really important to me in teaching the course. One is that students don't realize that conservation biology is a science, right? They think about conservation or environmental action, right, as an activity, and don't realize that there is a field of science behind that. Um, and the other thing I really emphasize in the course, well, I emphasize everything, but something that's really important for me to talk about are the practical impediments, right? The idea that we can have all the conservation biology we want, but translating that into conservation action is difficult to do. And one of the reasons it's difficult to do is because we disagree with other people in our societies about the importance of particular species relative to other things, right? Relative to each other, but also relative to other things. And so I think starting these conversations about value and what what plays into us deciding value is turning out to be really critically important. And I didn't realize it. I think for those of us um, interested in conservation, motivated by the need for conservation and the extinction crisis, we forget that other people haven't had the experience that we have, maybe don't have the inherent love of nature that we probably have. And so having these discussions, I think, is critically important. All right, so who are my students? Um, so as I mentioned, this is an upper level undergraduate course. Let's see if we can move this. I don't know if you guys can see that. It is an upper level undergraduate course, but the prerequisites for the course are really just our 1 year introductory biology sequence. Um, and students sometimes end up taking ecology or genetics, sometimes evolution before they take this course, but usually not. Sometimes they take it as a sort of, at the same time they're taking conservation biology. And I love it when they come to me and say, hey, we're also talking about this in ecology, or we're talking about this in evolution. And most of them are seniors, although not all of them are senior undergraduates. And the class varies in size between around 20 and 30 or so students. So relatively small. I say that I used to teach the introductory biology course, and that was, I don't know, 600 students. So I'm much happier teaching these days. And most of our biology majors are going to be pre-meds, right? We're a general biology department, not a sort of an ecology evolution department. Um, Many of the ones that also take introductory biology are pre-pharmacy, because we have the School of Pharmacy. And then a much smaller number are students that are getting a minor in biology or in environmental studies. And our environmental studies program is a humanities focused program. And so again, these are not necessarily people with a strong science background, although they are required to have taken that introductory biology course. All right, so that's sort of my course and the kind of students I have. They're students with very diverse backgrounds and diverse interests. And there's always students in that class who are taking it because it fits their schedule, right? They're just there, right? That they want to get some credits. And one of my favorite things is when students say, oh yeah, I heard it was a good class and it fit my schedule, so I took it. But I was surprised, I was actually interested, right? And that's exactly what we want, right? We want to recruit these people to understand how interesting and critical it is that they understand conservation biology. All right, so here's a little clip from my syllabus, and you can see in the beginning of the semester, we first define what conservation biology is, sort of the origins of the field, and then we spend some time on understanding what biodiversity is, the different sort of levels of biodiversity. And after that, we talk about the value of biodiversity and then move on to sort of threats to biodiversity and solutions. And so what I'm talking about today, the goal of this exercise, which actually the last part of it occurs sort of a week or two after the first part of it, is to sort of link concepts of conservation biology, definitions of conservation biology, to things that we measure in biodiversity, and then sort of bring that all back to this issue of then how do we value those things. And so for that first part, defining conservation biology, we introduce the postulates, the sort of principles behind conservation biology. And, amongst those are that it is a value-laden science, right? We're attaching value to saving things, right? To restoring things. And so, of course, biodiversity is good, ecological complexity is good, evolution is good and necessary. And then, right, biotic diversity, including species, has intrinsic value, right? Those are things that we have adopted as part of this value-laden science. Then under what is biodiversity, we talk about types of biodiversity, right? Genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystems. So pretty standard stuff there. And then, 3 weeks in, we get into types of value. These include use values, direct sort of use of things, right? Consumption. Indirect values, things that are public goods that we all benefit from. And then non-use values, sort of cultural values. And so students have all of this sort of going on at different stages. And I think this exercise I'll talk about kind of links these pieces together. All right. So on the previous slide, I mentioned that biotic diversity has intrinsic value. There's a section of text from Soule's paper in 1985, What is Conservation Biology, which was in the journal Bioscience. And he sort of talks in more detail as one of the sort of founders of the field of conservation biology about these postulates or principles. And I just want to pick out a few of these ideas because I point these out to students, and I think they sort of get to this, they help us think about how we need to consider what people mean by value. So one thing of course, biotic diversity has intrinsic value. So in this case, we're not talking about a species necessarily, but we are talking about that sort of diversity that, well, I guess we are when we're talking about genetic diversity, right? We're talking about biotic diversity within species, across species, and then the sort of larger ecosystem level. But then there are components of this in which Soulé is saying, but it's not just utilitarian value, right? We're not just talking about what it can do, what diversity can do for us, right? There's something that's important about species that is independent of our need for those species. And I think that's an important thing to bring up with students. And he mentions that we talk about an inherent value of non-human life. And that's great. I love that. But we run into a problem with that sort of subset of this because students don't necessarily understand the scale of value when it comes to application to conservation, right? They may appreciate non-human life, but maybe not always at the level of biological analysis that is important to conserving biodiversity at large. And I'll bring that up, and it's something weaved into my assignment. And then species have value in themselves, Soulé says. And then finally, and that value is neither conferred nor revocable, right? So Soulé is saying it doesn't matter really whether you like or dislike a certain species, whether you find value in it. It automatically has value because of its history here on the planet, right? All that it's been through to be what it is and to have survived to the present, right? That in and of itself is valuable, whether you like it or not. And I think that's something that over my entire course, students do come to value, right? They come to understand that even if they personally don't think it's pretty or have a direct use for it, that the species experience in its interactions with other species and its habitat, that in and of itself means that it's important, right? The great chain of life, right? The web of things and their interactions. That's something that I'm trying to build a student understanding of and during this course. All right, so that's sort of setting the stage for why I'm interested in how students value things and how I want them to have that conversation with each other. All right, so no questions yet. Everybody's cool so far? Yeah, okay, great. All right, so what is the assignment? The assignment starts in the second week of class, actually, with a value survey. And so at our institution, we're using the Blackboard course management system. You could do this with anything, I think. You could do this with Qualtrics. You could do this with other sort of online polling or survey. You could do this on index cards or pieces of paper. Be a lot more work to put the data together, but you could do it. You could even turn it around and have the students collect the information. I have the students do this outside of class, right? This is homework, basically. It is anonymous. I know which students have completed the survey, but I don't know how they've ranked species. And I do this because I make it anonymous because I want students to not feel as though they're being pressured in some way to rank certain species as having higher value than others, right? I don't want them to feel that they're being judged on how they value things. All right, so what does the survey contain? I've written, in most cases, I've modified descriptions I found elsewhere of 10 species, and I've put species in quotes because these are not actually all examples of species. And these descriptions are just textual. So there is no photograph. I ask students not to Google or look up the species, but rather to rank the value or assign the value based purely on the description. And I do that because I want all the students to be working from the same sort of set of information. Now, sure, some of them may have previous knowledge that they're bringing to some of those examples, but turns out most of them don't, which kind of surprises me, but I'll bring that up again later. So who are these 10 species? I actually picked these species carefully. I wanted to sort of have a cross-representation of various organisms on the planet. So I got 2 plants, 2 insects, a bird, a fish, an annelid worm, like an earthworm type worm, a parasitic nematode, right, which we might also call a worm because it looks wormy, but it's unrelated to other worms. And then 2 examples of domestic mammals. And I've chosen these actually quite carefully, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And in the survey, they're asked 1 species at a time, they're asked to read this text that gives information about the species. And then before they can move on to the next species, they're asked to assign some conservation value. And they can pick it as none, little, somewhat, valuable, or highly valuable. And they don't have to rank it. They're not limited in assigning these across all the species, right? They could put every species as highly valuable or all the species as not valuable at all, right? They're not using up value as they move through it. I also randomize the presentation of which species they see in what order. Here's an example of a description. So one of the species, the Oregon giant earthworm, one of North America's largest earthworm species. This sucker goes up to over 4 feet long. Imagine that. A 4-foot long earthworm. It's crazy. So it's only known from a limited area. Willamette Valley of Oregon, Oregon Coast Range, lives on only certain kinds of soils, right? So we're here it has a very specific habitat type. And it's associated in areas with certain kinds of trees. Habitat loss and invasive earthworms are a threat to the species. It mentions just casually sort of their biology. They're hermaphrodites, which I think probably all earthworms are. And then they have a role. They're major decomposers of dead and decomposing organic matter. It says how they get their nutrition, and they recycle, nutrients. Okay, so it describes it briefly. It tells where it lives, says something about its biology and something about its interaction with its environment. Okay, and so there are components like that in all of the descriptions. It also says a little bit about its endangerment. Here's another one. Okay, so this is one of the 2 mammals, the domestic mammals. And in this case, the species is actually an individual. This is true. This is a true story. Poor little PD was a little poodle found on the side of a highway in Los Angeles. I pulled this from a news report. Poor Petey was laying there for 24 hours, right? Seriously injured. And look, the cute name Petey, that comes from the fact that somebody from the police department picked it up. All right, so pretty serious stuff. Petey, though, was like, I know you're here to help me, and I'm not going to bite you, right? And so it describes poor Petey's injuries. And it says that, people are helping out. People are working hard to try to make sure that PD has a reasonable future. Okay, so you might look at this and say, oh, what does this have to do with conservation? Well, that's because you're all conservationists, right? Students often don't understand that conservation is, as a science, is something other than, you know, uh, liking plants and animals, liking nature. And so this example is put in there not because I don't love dogs. I love dogs, right? And I'm very sympathetic for poor Petey. But students often don't understand that this is important, but this is not a conservation issue, right? So that's why this is sort of moved in as one of the examples that I use. So, and I'll share, Martha, I'll create a Google Doc or something with all the descriptions. So if anyone wants to use these existing descriptions, you're most welcome to. So again, students don't see any pictures and they're asked not to look up pictures or information. They're supposed to only use the descriptions. But I'll show you pictures. My students don't see pictures until after they've seen the survey results. All right. So in the top row here, we have one of the plants. That's the Mauna Kea silver sword. It's an endemic plant found on the volcanic slopes on Mauna Kea in Hawaii. And next to that, you can see poor little PD. There's PD in the passenger seat. And yes, PD is adorable. Then we have the acacia ant, right, which has this great mutualism with acacia plants, acacia trees. And the description describes that evolved association between those two species. And the bird is the Arapipe manakin. That's a male. And you can see how brightly colored it is. And they're highly endangered. They have a very small range, threatened by plans to develop a water park or something in Brazil. So a plant, a doggy, an ant, and a bird. And then for the other six species, we have monarch butterflies, pretty classic. In the middle there, you can see a picture of the nematode, Eustrongelides. This is a parasite, obligate parasite. It's, as an adult, it's in the intestines of wading birds. And the eggs come out in the feces, are eaten by oligochaetes, freshwater worms, that then are eaten by an intermediate host, a small fish, that is then eaten by the definitive host, the bird. And so they have that sort of complex life cycle. On the fish, that's the humpback chub. I included that in part because it's got a really distinctive name for a fish, but a description of its value, for instance, to Native Americans is included in the description. And then here's a few more: the longleaf pine and the ecosystem it inhabits, a critically important ecosystem in the southeastern United States. This is the mulefoot hog. This is a domestic pig species, or breed rather, that is considered endangered because people don't keep very many of them anymore. And then the Oregon giant earthworm. So students, again, don't see these pictures when they're sort of ranking the species. But I bring these pictures after they've seen the rankings to see whether they change their mind on their ranking based on seeing what it looks like. And I think that's an important thing to do in the class as well. All right, so now I am going to try a word salad kind of poll thing. Let's see if I can pull this off. All right, so this poll is going to have two questions. It's going to ask you, which species do you think gets the most high value scores from students? And then which species do you think gets the most no value, no conservation value scores from students? And you don't have to get the wording right. I think you're just going to type in a word or two for this when I pull it up. Your choices are the worm or giant worm, right? Petey the dog, the hog breed, the acacia ant, the humpback chub or fish, the bird, Arapipi mannequin, the parasitic nematode, the monarch butterfly. Oh, I got hog up here twice. Don't put hog twice. The pine tree, silver sword. If I have that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah. The silver sword is the Hawaiian plant. Okay. So now, let me see. I'm going to try to switch over to all right. Now, in a perfect world, you should be able to see this little Slido QR code.
Yes.
Okay, great. And if you could answer the first question, which species did students say had the highest conservation value? So you just aim your phone at that thing. I haven't done this yet. Hopefully it works. All right, words are coming up. Good. All right. I know the answer, so I'm not going to put it up there. Oh, interesting. All right, I got 8 people who answered. There's more than 8 of you. Come on. All right. Oh, a lot of people are going for bird. Monarch butterfly, though, seems to be number 1. Dog. Dog's getting bigger, bird's getting bigger. Remember, there's a fish, there's a nematode, there's a Hawaiian silver sword. Nobody thought mulefoot hog. Oh, ant. All right. Got some ant lovers. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Oops, I got somebody typing. Oh, nice. All right. Martha, how many people are in here? Is that like 15?
You've got 20 besides yourself.
Okay.
Yeah, you're pretty close. There's always somebody who just can't commit.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So, looks like people believe that students would say that monarch butterflies have the highest conservation value. A lot of people pick dog, though, so that's interesting. More than bird. Hmm. All right, let's move on to our next question. Which species did the students say had no conservation value? So dog, bird, nematode, giant earthworm, longleaf pine. All right, this is actually more fun than I thought it would be, Martha. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. All right, Nancy couldn't vote, but she went for monarch and nematode for the negative one. Yeah, so this is what we think students said. The question we're asking here is what you think students may have said. All right, so you think most people thought nematodes would not be valued by students at all, that they would think they were unimportant. Pine trees got several votes, though. Butterfly got some. That's in opposition to the previous voting. Silver sword plant, one of my favorites. All right, interesting. All right, who wants to find out if they were right or wrong? Yay, okay. So now, let me switch over here. Stop sharing. Thank you for voting, everybody. Back to this. All right. Da, 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 da. All right. So let me orient you here. So these are the results from last year, from last spring. And from left to right, the color coding represents a no conservation value, little conservation value, somewhat value, valuable to conservation, and a high conservation value. And so the color coding going with those are dark blue for none, kind of orangish or little, gray somewhat, yellow valuable, lighter blue for high value. And what I've put up on the top are the ones that I personally felt had no conservation value. Poor Petey the dog, he may have value, but and so that what this is the number of students in the class that picked those for each those conservation categories. And so there were people who agreed with me that poor Petey, 5 people felt he has no conservation value. And of course, he doesn't in terms of conserving biodiversity because he is a domestic breed, impossibility, he cannot reproduce. PD may have value, but he doesn't have conservation value. But look over on the right on the top, right? What do we have there? 7 or 8, 9 students felt that PD, the dog, had high conservation value, right? And so that's usually reflects 2 things, right? It reflects that they don't understand yet what conservation actually is. Or maybe they do, but they're unwilling emotionally to say that PD doesn't have any value, right? It's that conflict we sometimes have between animal welfare, the welfare of an individual, and the sort of larger conservation goals. And that's important to know about, right, for students, right? It's important to know if they have that sort of perspective so that you can address the issue of that it's okay to care about PD in a context other than conservation, right? That's a different thing. It doesn't mean it's not important. It's just a different thing. It's not the scientific view of conservation. And look here, I mean, just as many people said PD had no value as Eustrongilides, the nematode parasite, right? But notice that almost nobody, 2 people, said that the parasite has high conservation value, right? They sort of knew, all right, I got to put a little here because I'm not going to say it has no value, but they didn't sense that it could be important. Now, what were the most important things? Take a look at longleaf pine, right? Longleaf pine, the majority of the class felt that that had the highest conservation value, right? Surprising to me, this happens year after year. Martha.
Sorry, I could let you go. I'm just curious. Do you think it's because you're in Mississippi? And do you have longleaf pine ecosystems where they would see them?
Well, as you know, most of the longleaf pine has been wiped out of its range. It's like 99% of its range is gone. And but I assume that the students, not all our students are from Mississippi, but a lot of them are from the Southeast. And so I assumed they had prior exposure. Turns out very few of our students um, had any experience. They'd not actually seen longleaf pines, they'd heard of it, but they hadn't learned about it. And it was the description that was compelling to them because it talks about how longleaf pines create an ecosystem that other species depend on. And that's what caused them to rank it so highly. It's the species interactions that were important. And it turns out that was also true of the giant earthworm. Some people loved it because it was a huge worm, but other people loved that it was providing a service. It was decomposing, it was breaking things down. So students seem to be, the majority of them, very motivated by a species that was doing something useful for its environment. Not necessarily utilitarian for us, but it was doing something useful for where it lived. I'm surprised by some things. Like I thought monarchs would do much better, and they didn't. Acacia ants, a fascinating, right, co-evolved system. Nope, they didn't love it. The Arapipi mannequin, right? Sure, they didn't see a picture of it, so that didn't do too well. Notice that the mulefoot hog, right, which is a breed of domestic pig, very few people said it had no value, and some people thought it had high value. So I think that's kind of interesting. All right. So anyone have any questions about what's on the screen? These results? Oh, Sarah.
Hi, I'm really interested in the description for the parasite. Did it include that it was harmful to hosts? And do you think that that was partially why it scored so low in the students' ranking?
It does. It says something like has been known to cause death of nestlings that are fed parasitized fish. And in fact, this parasite is in greater abundance because of the use of artificial wetlands to clean previously clean sewage water, right, to get rid of nutrients. And that increases, I guess, oligochaetes, and fish love them, and so birds then bring them back to their nestlings. So yeah, that's definitely in there. All right, so a lot of people said monarchs. So feel free to speak up if you thought monarchs. Yes, you can raise your hand or just speak up. Why did you think monarchs were going to be the one that they loved?
I was just wondering if all of the species descriptions had like their ecosystem roles or like benefits as part of the description.
Yeah, I think the one I failed on actually is the Arapipi mannequin. I realized I didn't say much about that in the description. And I think that harmed the poor mannequin. Plus, I think they had no idea what a mannequin is. Like they knew it was a bird, but they couldn't really visualize what a mannequin might look like. So I think that was an issue for mannequin as well.
Yeah, I'm just curious if like it was kind of, do you think it was like priming them by including the benefits for some but not others, and then like doing a very like biological and literal description for some, but then like an emotional kind of trauma story, like a case study for others?
Um, so I think the sort of trauma story for PD was inevitable, right? I mean, I think that's PD's story, and that's his interaction with other species, is his interaction with us. Um, I tried to sort of even things out as much as possible. Sorry about that. If you can hear the background noise. So certainly there's some component here, but like monarch butterflies, when I share the description, you'll see, I mean, it's a pretty amazing description of all that they can do. You would have thought they did better.
Thanks.
Anybody?
I just want to jump in, sorry, to just follow up on that and saying that just even by having the variance, it could really lead to some very interesting conversations about storytelling, about conservation storytelling, and what resonates and what do you focus on. So I guess there's a difference between if you want this to be a scientific study about value and making sure that it's gone across, or if it's a conversation starter, then having those various approaches for how these are described and then having students reflect on why they put the importance on it, I think can uncover a lot.
Yeah, thanks. I think my goal was to try to put them on equal footing. But I think even if you do that, right, there's everyone's personal preferences, their history. Maybe they had a poodle, right? Maybe they're into weird things. When I say weird things, I mean, you know, most conservation is focused on mammals and birds. So, but there are people who love reptiles or love strange insects. So, yeah, there's a lot that comes into this, certainly.
Yeah, to kind of jump in, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
To follow up on that, yeah, I think it's tempting to kind of parse this further into like the different types of value, right? You've got direct, indirect, instrumental, etc. But the fact that it's sort of amalgamated, it, as Suzanne was saying, it sort of elucidates or allows people to reflect on the complexity. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
And so I've got 4 years of this, and the one thing that is consistent year after year is that they like the longleaf pine and the earthworm, and they don't like the parasite, right? Other things shift around a bit. Petey sometimes gets a lot of high value votes. He really does. Yeah. Nicole?
Yeah, I enjoyed this activity, and just building on the other great comments that have already been made. I think the PD case also offers an opportunity for students to think about, very often in conservation, we think at the population level, but in the case of endangered species or highly, highly, highly threatened species, sometimes every individual counts, right? So for example, the North Atlantic right whale, where we have less than 400 individuals left in the whole population. So I think it also brings up an opportunity for conversation about, you know, the value system of why some people get involved with rescue and rehabilitation, which is sort of adjacent to some of the aspects of animal welfare that we see for domesticated pets and that sort of thing. So I see PD as being a great entree point to get students thinking about when it comes to prioritizing our values or how we allocate very limited resources in conservation practice. When you start to get to some of those impediments that you were referring to earlier on, those were just some of the disorganized thoughts I was having in reaction to this activity.
No, definitely right. And I think, you know, later on in the course, we talk about how the California condor should be a conservation success, right? But the problem is that we keep poisoning them with lead, right? And we're catching up individuals. And why do we do that? Why do we go to this great expense? And of course, it's because individuals are suffering, but it's also because each one is so critically important to the future of the population. So yeah, I think, Nicole, in a sense, I do that. But I should think about that, about weaving that back into this. Yeah, great idea. All right, let me move on here. Oh, come on. There we go. All right, so what do I do with this in the class? I ask, after we post those results on the screen, just like you saw, I asked the class to discuss and share what were the factors that led each student to deciding one species had more value and others less? I can tell you that students are super reticent about sharing why they valued species the way they did. There are some, there are always the reliable students who are willing to participate. I don't pick on students because I don't know how they valued things, but I might say, okay, is there anyone who thought the worm was or the nematode was important, right? And there are occasionally people who will speak up and talk about, oh yeah, well, it provides balance. It makes sure there aren't too many wading birds, right? So there's some students who have maybe taken ecology and know a little bit more. And then what I do is this think, pair, share thing where I have the students speak to a partner in the class. It's a group of 2, sometimes 3, and I ask them to find out were they using the same factors to rank species the way their partner did, or were they looking at different factors, either to say it was important or to say it was unimportant, right? Because there's a number of reasons you could think that giant earthworm is important. You might think it's cool, right? You might think, oh, it's crucial to the ecosystem. And so what we wanted to do is find out from each other, what are the reasons you thought it was important or unimportant? And then students write up, I just use index cards. They write a sort of summary of what they learned about how the person next to them thinks about things differently or the same, right? And that students really dig that. They're really into that. And I have these index cards. They're writing so tiny to try to fit in everything they want to say about it. And of course, I give them index cards because I don't want to read more than an index card's worth for 20, 30 people. But this seems to work pretty well. And students don't believe me that the parasite is important, right? So I follow up and talk about how important parasites, just like predators are, in sort of, I don't want to use the word regulating, but affecting how species are able to compete and use the ecosystem. And so then I don't talk about this for a while, but when I talk about other ecosystem services, I talk about ecosystem services by things like freshwater mussels. And I show a video actually, but here's a clip showing how this tank with no mussels in it, the water remains turbid and dirty. And after 24 hours with mussels filter feeding, the water becomes cleaner. And of course, the southeastern US is like the world's epicenter of freshwater mussel biodiversity, right? They're critically important. And so students readily agree that freshwater mussels, even though we don't really eat them or anything, we don't use them directly, are really important to the ecosystem. And then I surprise students by letting them know that freshwater mussels are in fact parasites. They have a parasitic stage, a required parasitic stage to their life cycle, right? Freshwater mussels reproduce by attracting fish to strike at the lure on a mussel, and then all these little glaucidia, all these little baby mussels grab on to the gills of the fish, and that's a required stage, and the fish actually transport them elsewhere. They're probably getting some nutrients directly from the blood vessels in the gills. And mussels don't spread, right, and colonize habitat without their fish hosts. And sometimes they have very exacting hosts. So this is sort of a trick I play on the students to get them to realize that just because something harms or kills something else and you find it kind of gross doesn't mean that that species doesn't have an important part to play in naturally functioning ecosystems. And students will sort of begrudgingly agree about this. And so this is something that they feel I've tricked them. But of course, yes, I have tricked them, but it also opens their eyes. And so I found this sort of trick that I introduce a bit later is really valuable. They love wolves in Yellowstone, right? Controlling elk so that aspen can regrow, but they don't love parasites affecting the distribution of other species. All right, so I thought what we could do, what do we have? We have a couple minutes, maybe.
You have 10.
10 minutes, yeah. Could we talk about some other ideas about what you think we might be able to do with this? How might it apply to the kind of things you do in your teaching efforts? Speak up as you see fit. Stuart has his hand raised.
Yeah, the first thing that jumps to mind for me is I teach a policy course focusing on Canadian conservation policy, and carrying this exercise forward into having students maybe work in groups to look at what types of policy interventions are there for the different species. You can maybe even dig up information on how much funding is allocated to them in different aspects, and so that you've got the monetary value, and then these other conceptions of value as well. So, yeah, I'd be tempted to push students towards the policy angles on value.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So finding out whether perceived value and sort of actual funding go hand in hand. Interesting.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Diana?
Hi. Oh, my background changed. Yeah, I was curious if you go into any economical value for various species, because I know one of the things that I'm involved in, I keep getting like pulled in more and more with the wild horses, everything that's happening with wild horses and Bureau of Land Management, et cetera. Those of us who are trying to advocate for the horses are trying to say we really need to turn some of this around and pointing out to the local communities the economical value of those species, because they're bringing in, the ecotourism and bringing in so much to the communities. So does any of that ever come into at least this part of your course or the discussion?
Yeah, so in the course, we certainly talk about how we can have different components of support or funding, be it contrary purposes, right? So, we're spending many millions of dollars on rounding up wild horses and keeping them in pens, right? Which I think everyone agrees is probably not great for the horses. And at the same time, the government is, local governments support things like trap, spay, neuter for feral cats that are eating birds and rodents and things, right? So there are all these kinds of things where you have contrary objectives going on. And I think that you're right. It does play into this idea of value, that there are different reasons we value different things. Now, I don't do a lot about, we talk about ecotourism value, right? Because it's introductory, we don't talk about it deeply as sort of, okay, what's the opposing argument, right? There might be reasons we don't want people in wilderness areas. There are reasons we don't want wild horses. But then there are reasons why we do, right? And so, yeah, I think that's a cool idea, Diana. It might be an interesting thing to develop as a debate that sort of circles back to value, different types of value. Yeah, I'll think about that some more. Victoria?
Hey, can you hear me okay? Sometimes my microphone is weird. It sounds okay? Okay. Sorry, this is really, really fun. I really, really like this this work. It's really related to my dissertation. I studied like how humans relate and value bats, right? For my, and you mentioned it in your intro talk. So this is kind of like my whole thing. So it's kind of sparking a lot of really, really fun stuff. to me, what I feel like a lot of what like you measured in your value survey is a lot of like our pre-existing like notions about some of these species and like to me it's really highlighting a lot of like pre-existing conceptualizations of conservation, but also like, you know, I don't know, like broader things about our societal relationships to wildlife and animals. So something I'm thinking about too is like I wonder if it'd be a cool like a pre-survey activity where people can kind of like do like word associations with certain groups or species, right? I don't know.
Mm.
That's what's making me think of like when I think of a pine, I think of, you know, habitat, or I think of, I don't know. I would like to, just as a little survey person, I'm just getting all brain jazzed about like, you know, how could I explore a little bit, have some way to explore deeper into like what associations or cultural associations are happening in people's minds as they're then going forth and making their value judgments, right? Um,
Yeah,
so
like worms. Like I didn't expect there to be
mhm,
a lot of people liking worms,
mhm.
you know?
But
And
yeah,
so that would be the kind of thing you could ask beforehand to find out. Maybe, you know, the first day of the course, um, just have what seem like some innocuous questions about their experiences and um, what kind of animals and plants they've had interactions with.
yeah, that's something. Yeah, exactly. Like kind of yeah, what's I feel like sometimes it's nice to pair that way with relationships to wildlife in general, or like a tool that I've used in classes is like this great. It's called like America's Wildlife Value Survey that by
Hmm.
Manfredo and colleagues at CSU Fort Collins. And so they had this like really standardized, and I think it's pretty public. And they've been measuring America's wildlife values in these huge surveys for like 30 years.
Oh,
And their conclusion is that as a culture in America, our values have shifted from domination over nature towards like mutualistic relationships. And so anyway, it's some cool work that could be a nice like addition or supplement for like the discussion in terms of how our culture has changed and shifted, you know, or something like that. Anyway, sorry, my brain excited. Thanks, Rich.
honeybees, I think would be interesting.
Yeah.
Throw in there, right?
Hmm.
European honeybees, right? It's another one of those sort of conflicting situations where people have heard a lot of good things, and people generally, I think, like honey. Um, and yet, that's in terms of biodiversity, that's not the thing we should be worried about conserving. Katie has her hand up. Katie Shaw.
Yeah. Um, yeah, thanks. I really love the point you started with on how it's hard to translate some of this into conservation action because of how people have differences in valuing species. And I'm just curious, what do you think was the like most important takeaway you've learned, if you were looking at it in terms of conducting a behavior change conservation campaign?
Specifically the survey or sort of my course overall?
Either.
Okay. Um, all right. I think commonly in academics, we train people thinking that they're going to have the same careers as we have. And what I guess what I've discovered is that students are looking to be surprised and engaged. Uh, and I think the number one thing we can do for them is to remove that impediment that it's weird or unacceptable to be interested in these things when you want to be a doctor or a pharmacist, right? I think one of our impediments for our students of doing good things in conservation is that they think maybe they're not supposed to be doing that because they have other career interests. And I know that's kind of a lame answer, I think, in some ways, right? But we've got a country of people who, in survey after survey, say they love nature, but then people don't vote or act that way, right? In general. And so I think I see it in my students. They kind of open up and get excited about these ideas that they thought were simplistic and actually turn out to be quite complex and involve not just science, but human emotion and experience and politics.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
Well, we are coming to a close of our hour. Richard, I don't know if you've got anything else you want to be sure we hear. We also do have a break coming up, a half-hour break. And one of the options is to keep talking or to, so we can still use this breakout room as a place to have further exchange if you'd like to do that. The other options are like getting food if it's lunchtime for you, or you just need snacks, or stretching because your body needs to move. But so first, Richard, is there anything else you want to say?
Just that, as I mentioned, I'll share with Martha a link to the species descriptions so you can look at them and see what you think of them. And I encourage you to give this a try. I think even in sort of community settings, it's important to have conversations about what people value and why maybe they should consider additional things when they evaluate species. And I think that's an important conversation to have. Yeah, and so I'll share those descriptions. Maybe make up your own or modify them or whatever. I can share the photos as well, although I don't remember where I got all of those. But yeah, I'll stay on for a couple of minutes if anyone wants to talk about more or has any questions. And thank you for attending.
Thank you. That's great. I really appreciate it. Definitely thinking of new ideas. I'm going to stop recording.